Our next talk is by Ben Saunders of Wessex Archaeology, talking about Cockenzie harbour.
Thank you for getting the clapping out of the way early doors. Thank you. Sorry I'm on the wonk a little bit. My cruciate ligament has decided to rebel, but nothing will stop me talking about Cockenzie harbour, which has become a moderate obsession of both myself and the Wagonway group that operate out of there. So thank you very much for coming to talk. This is going to look at the development of Cockenzie harbour, a small tidal harbour in East Lothian. It's going to cover the recent work that has utilised a number of techniques to investigate the history of this small industrial harbour. There we go. This work was largely funded by East Lothian Council and Historic Development Scotland, with parts of the research aspects was also supported by money from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. The project impetus has really come from the 1722 Wagonway group, who have a stall downstairs. I'd encourage anyone who hasn't been to see them to go and have a chat. Based next to the harbour, who have spent the last 8 years running community heritage projects based around the Trent-Cockenzie Wagonway, one end of which terminated at the harbour. Some of the information on the harbour has been directly provided by excavations and surveys completed by this group, including the turntable base and the coal drop apparatus that's shown in this photo from the 2018 excavations. In addition to this work, metric surveys, including photogrammetric modelling from an aerial drone survey, was completed with the elevations of the eastern pier head shown here. This dataset, along with a walkover of the site, informed the condition survey within a conservation management plan for the harbour completed by Wessex Archaeology between 2020 and 2022, which was reported on at the Nautical Archaeological Society conference in Dunleary last year. This CMP also presented a number of areas where there was missing information. The gaps in knowledge mostly relate to the construction and development of the harbour. Spurred on by this, the project team started to investigate. As the harbour was designed by Robert Stevenson, we were hopeful that historic records would survive within the NLS's Stevenson archive. Alongside this, we did a GPR survey of the harbour structures, which investigated the physical makeup of the pier and quaysides, as well as looking for potential damage. And I'm quite glad that someone's already talked about GPR, so I don't have to go into detail too much about it, because I don't understand it. It's magic. So the earliest record of harbour infrastructure in Cockenzie dates to the 17th century, when the Earl of Winton ordered its construction. This early harbour was destroyed by a storm in the middle of the 17th century and replaced by a harbour at Port Seton. In the first report into the harbour in 1829, Stevenson notes that Scots Act of Parliament concerns this earlier harbour and remarks the remains of that stone pier, which was mapped by Adair in the late 17th century, were still extant in 1829. Within the original Stevenson plans for the harbour, the 1829 ones, there are pencil drawings of rubble material beneath the suggested construction, which is in red. It suggests that the 17th century harbour included a rubble breakwater which narrowed the gap between the rocky shoreline to improve the shelter within the bay. It also appears that an eastern quayside was in place. The import and export of some material, including potentially the salt from the nearby salt pans, may have continued from the beach harbour after the destruction of the former harbour and the quayside. Down. Whoop. Steady. That one. This early harbour may also have been picked up in the geophysics, with a clear difference between the material within the eastern quay, the dark grey in the image, compared to the material in the east. When compared with the plan above, it appears that the dark grey material relates to the infill for the original eastern quayside, and the adaptations to the harbour in the 19th century pushed the eastern quayside back to the east, removing material from the earlier harbour. The coal mines in Tranent and the surrounding land down to Cockenzie were bought by the York Buildings Company following the confiscation of the Earl of Winton's assets after the 1715 Jacobite uprising. This ownership saw the creation of the first wagonway, linking the Tranent mines to the Cockenzie saltworks and to the harbour at Port Seton. These assets were then bought in the 1770s by the Cadell family, who were the owners of the Carron ironworks. They invested in updating the wagonway, the coal mines, and also expanded the salt pan installations along the seafront, as seen by the Wagonway Group's excavations this summer. So, becoming somewhat of a pattern, the harbour at Port Seton was destroyed by a storm in 1810. just stop building harbours there. It's not, anyway. And the area around it became, Cockenzie experienced extreme economic strain, probably as a result of not being able to easily export the coal and the salt. It's possible that, again, small-scale export was completed through the beach harbours at Cockenzie, but this would have been very dangerous, as well as severely limiting the size of the vessel that could be used. At this point, Henry Francis Cadell decided to commission plans for a new harbour at Cockenzie from Robert Stevenson. The Stevenson archive at the NLS holds copies of the exchange of letters between Cadell and Stevenson, with the first in May 1829. One of Stevenson's surveyors, James Ritson, was sent out to Cockenzie to survey the area in July 1829. Correspondence between Cadell and Stevenson shows that both felt the planned harbour to be a solid proposal. The earliest sketch shows the layout of buildings in Cockenzie at the time, between the wagonway and the boat shore, between the harbour and the boat shore. They also show Stevenson's plans to reroute the wagonway to enable it to utilise the new pier, as well as the plans to remove a number of salt houses and other buildings. A report and updated plan in September 1829 shows that the eastern pier would have effectively restored the earlier one, with an additional return head. The western rocks were to be dressed to create a pier head and a small breakwater constructed between them and the land. Suggestions for more extensive excavations eastward, which would have removed several salt houses and the smithy, were abandoned. The excavation of the bottom of the harbour was hoped to provide substantial amounts of building material for the harbour, which would keep costs down. It was interesting to hear Andy talking about sand being used for the mortar, beach sand being used for the mortar. That's potentially what's also happening at Cockenzie Harbour. Stevenson was operating as a consultant engineer here. He's not going to be the one building this, nor is his company. So he billed Cadell £26 and 5 shillings for the plans, specifications, and outline cost of the harbour at this point of a mere £1,365. Bargain. Cadell was distracted by the ventures for a couple of years, in particular the East Lothian Railway Company, in which he was director. An updated harbour plan was put forward again in 1833. The specification into the harbour went into a great deal of detail about the construction techniques and material required, presumably as a guide for the foreman and for Cadell, who was specifically noted as the superintendent for the construction. And these specifications all survive within the Stevenson archive at the NLS. By the summer of 1834, the eastern pier and the quayside had been completed, probably along with the western breakwater. The small piece of wall linking that to the shoreline wasn't completed until probably late 1835. The GPR did pick up some anomalies which could be these tie walls. Is that the zapper? Yes. Happy days. Described by Stevenson within the specifications. They were very, very faint within the GPR, which was quite confusing. They should have been really obvious, they're big lumps of stone. But reading through the construction specification, it requires the rubble hearting within the pier to be tied into these tie walls quite strongly. And that may well be the reason for it being quite faint within the GPR, within the return signals, as opposed to the hearting being poorly sorted and more liable to breaking up. So in the first years after construction, the harbour was a bustling place, as shown by the image here and here. That's actually an advertisement for Cockenzie by the Cadell. That's available to purchase for a mere £25 from the wagonway stand downstairs. So lovely. I've got commission on that. In the first years after it was bustling place, the image on the right shows 2 collier sailing ships alongside the eastern pier and quay, and a number of smaller sailing and rowing boats drawn up onto the beach and heading out of the harbour. Stevenson writes in a letter to Cadell in 1835 about how impressed he was by the number of vessels calling there. Cadell also ordered the rebuilding of the wagonway around the harbour to enable more efficient export of coal, as the 1841 plan shows. 3 coal drops were present, each with a turntable to enable the wagon to drop straight into waiting vessels, with a wooden chute to enable loading at various states of the tide. The updated route of the wagonway from Tranent has also been identified in excavations along the eastern side of the harbour, with iron chairs for the rails and sleeper box being found in situ. The coal drops, wagon lifts and turntables may have been very early examples of these technologies, and the wagon lift specifically became the type example for others around Scotland, with Stevenson asking Cadell for a copy of the Cockenzie lifts drawings, so he could advise other harbours on their construction. So the Stevenson version of this drawing survives within the archive there. A letter from Stevenson to Cadell in summer 35 shows how well the new harbour was doing. Nevertheless, correspondence between the two is clear that there are practical issues with the harbour from sand infilling it and making the southern berths on the eastern side inaccessible. They therefore submit a new copy of plans, specifications and an estimate for the costs in summer 1841. This work, which was estimated to cost another £1,300, would have seen the south quay wall moved south to provide space for a second berth on the eastern quay, and substantial amounts of the bedrock within the basin of the harbour excavated to deepen the water in the harbour and enable larger ships to berth in it. If we compare the suggested sections on the 1841 plan with profiles generated from the 3D model of the harbour, made as part of the CMP works, it became clear that the southern quay wall had not been moved south, and therefore at least some of the proposed works in 1841 had not taken place. An August survey of the sand in the harbour in February 23 demonstrated that no further deepening had taken place, and this is borne out by further letters from the Stevenson archive. Got quite a nice little bit of a little measurement mystery within here. On the sections for the 1841 plans, we noticed the measurements for the sections had 3 decimal places, which is unusual in imperial measurements. Elsewhere on the plans, the measurements were in yards and feet, as you'd expect at this time. Mark, one of the volunteers from the project, who's got an interest in engineering, was particularly interested by this. This demarcation of measurement was only used on sections where material was to be removed, and he discovered that the use of decimal measurements was required when working out the volume of material to be removed using logarithmic calculations. So that's why these specific measurements were in decimal imperial, and that is true across any Stevenson plan that requires material to be removed that we've seen within the archive. I think there's one at Ayr that has it too. So a last attempt at getting this harbour deepened, Thomas Stevenson, having made himself the firm's harbour expert, once again put forward a suggestion for deepening Cockenzie Harbour, alongside building a slipway to provide repair facilities for the local fishing fleet. He also felt that the presence of a slipway would prevent the eastern side of the harbour from infilling with sand. It doesn't. Neither of these suggestions were completed at this time. However, this aerial image from 1935 shows the trading vessels have abandoned Cockenzie in favour of deeper harbours, and only the fishing fleet, made up of Fifes and Zulus, remains. It also nicely shows that the vessels are using the sandy beach on the east side to pull up safely. By the 1858 image on the bottom right there, the Weatherheads boat building yard has been established, and the boat slip, crane bases and concrete anchoring points within the harbour have all been installed. In the early 1950s, it was used to import material for the construction of Cockenzie Power Station, which saw some limited repairs to the harbour, largely based around the concrete screeding on the pier. The size of the Weatherheads yard is clearly demonstrated in that photo, with the large building sheds south of the harbour and the design and lofting sheds to the east. All of that industry is now gone, replaced by housing and CFA Archaeology. Not all of CFA Archaeology, they're just their processing sheds. So just to conclude very quickly, the research has been so successful partly because of Cockenzie is an oddity, as we all can understand. A focus of early innovation that was then bypassed for later development due to the technological changes it inspired. The harbour was developed specifically as the export hub for the wagonway, but at the same time as the railways were expanding rapidly. These railways removed the main function of the harbour, making it a backwater. It's this very isolation that has preserved an incredible time capsule. Anywhere else, this small industrial harbour would have been subsumed into Victorian docklands or buried beneath housing. Bringing together a non-intrusive survey in the form of GPR, targeted excavation and archive research has meant this small harbour may now be the best understood in Scotland. We can understand, and deservedly so. We can see how it was planned, why it was built, and then how it has been adapted over the years. The project has also brought together volunteers and provided them with skills, new friendships, and a heightened interest in the past. So just that one. Thank you very much for everyone who's involved in the project. Thank you.